All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the latest in our series of best practice webinars for EMC's Digital Service Operations group. Today, we are going to be covering synthetic metric rules with your presenter, Thad White, along with Todd and Brent as backup. A couple of just house cleaning items. We do these webinars for 30 minutes at 10 a.m. every other Wednesday, so there will be another one in 2 weeks. And following that, 2 weeks later, we'll have another one. There is a calendar available on Communities that I will link to from the invite for this event. And today we are using our new WebEx account for events for the first time. So if you have a question during the course of the presentation, please use the Q&A section, which you should see in your WebEx panel. And at the end of the presentation, when there's time for Q&A, I will attempt to enable audio for everybody so you can actually speak and ask your questions if you would like. If anything comes up technically or you have any challenges during the session, please use the chat window to chat to me directly or to presenters or to all participants, and I'll keep an eye on that and try to answer any issues that come up. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Thad White, lead technical marketer for Digital Service Operations.
Thank you, Seth, very much. Please let me know if my audio is not clear. And hello, everyone, and thank you for attending this session on synthetic metric rules. The goal for this session is to lay out some practices, techniques, methods, maybe that you could benefit your synthetic monitoring implementation by streamlining the event generation process using synthetic metric rules. Let's set some quick parameters around this discussion to kind of help you understand where I'm coming from in delivery and hone in on the topic a little bit better. So first of all, for the demo portion of this, and actually for the entire presentation, I'm going to be discussing and showing the latest release of TrueSight Operations Management with the synthetic monitoring component, and that's version 11.03.01. Okay. There have been some changes in the synthetic metric rule portion, even from 11.0 to 11.3. So if you haven't seen it yet, you'll get to see it here firsthand. I'm also aware, right, that you have the option of grabbing all of the synthetic data via the APM knowledge module and sending it to the TSIM server for analytics and eventing from there. But that's not what we're going to be discussing in this session. We're going to be concentrating on the synthetic metric rules that are actually generated from the App Visibility Manager component of TrueSight Operations Management. So my hope is at the end of the session, right, we'll have some feedback from both newer and more experienced customers on maybe how they've implemented their synthetic metric rules in their environments, or maybe just have a really good discussion on what the best way is to do that. As Seth mentioned, I've got some couple of smart guys behind me that'll be answering questions in the Q&A window, and they'll also be available for the live session at the end. So let's get started. Well, I say that and I can't advance my slide. 1 second. Here we go. So let's get started by discussing the event types that are generated from synthetic transactions, right? So they naturally differ from what you would get from a standard event format from the TSIM side. So you have availability, accuracy, execution, and performance. And these definitions are straight from the documentation on this subject. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and do quick shout out to about our documentation on synthetic metric rules. It's very, very good. So if you haven't seen it and you have some questions after this, go check the documentation first. It'll probably answer your question. So availability is fairly easy, right? It's when an application either doesn't respond or returns an error when something is not available. Accuracy is a little bit little different, right? So it does some function evaluations to determine that the accuracy, like link checking, content validation, title validation, and response data verification. Execution really doesn't have anything to do with the health of the application that you're testing. It would indicate a problem with the T agent being able to execute the script that is supposed to run against the application. But that's a nice thing to know about. And then naturally, performance is another event type that is going to show the, it's pretty self-explanatory. How long did the transaction take, and so on. So those are the 4 event types. And while I'm here, I'm going to mention something that's a little known configuration item that's fairly new, but it may help some of you depending on your situation. And that's the option. We give you the option now of reclassing the accuracy and or execution errors into an availability error, right? Now, this may not cut down on the number of events in the grand scheme of things, but it may be an option to consider if you consider inaccurately turned information an availability error and you're generating availability type reports. And that, the way that you configure that is through editing a file on the collector of the App Visibility Manager component and then restarting the collector. And that's covered very well in the documentation as well. So just thought I would mention that while we're here at this point. So let's move on. So what you're looking at here is a screenshot, actually two different screenshots, one on the top and then the line one on the bottom, of an example of the exact same error that was picked up by a bad event, synthetic event configuration and a good synthetic event configuration. So in the top example, right, you see I get 6 different events for one outage. In the bottom example, you see I get 1. Okay, and so that's kind of what we're going to focus on here for the rest of the presentation is kind of how I got here and what are some things that you can do to get to this type of reduction in the number of events that you would get. And just to give you an idea of how some of this stuff works and some of the things that you can do in your environment to make it much more streamlined. So of those 6 events on the top that you see in the bad configuration, I purposely configured the events that come from the SLA portion of the eventing for synthetic as critical. So those are all from SLA. You can see it starts with synthetic SLA. And then the ones that are major, you can see start with synthetic rule. Those come from the synthetic metric rule portion of the configuration. So let's dive into this from a demo perspective and kind of get down to the bottom of it. We're going to start, even though this presentation is focusing on synthetic metric rules, I feel that the SLA component needs an honorable mention here because it is part of a best practice that we'll talk about here. So I'm going to start with looking at the SLA portion of this. So starting in whenever TrueSight, when we first came out with TrueSight Operations Management, it was version 10.0, the only configuration we had for generating rules or generating events from the App Visibility component was SLA, right? And we've just carried that forward. We haven't really done anything to it from 10.0 all the way to 11.301, which is where we're at today. And synthetic SLA is a not very flexible way, putting it gently, to generate events against the data from your synthetic transactions. And these aren't based on thresholds that you would typically set. Like these are based on a percentage of breaches of the thresholds that you set, which is why they call it SLA, right? So you can see here, there's a minor threshold breach at 10%, critical at 20%, and really the only configuration that you have is to send a notification or not, okay? And then naturally you can also set this being the performance rule, you can set a time base on what that is. So it's not very flexible. The only other option that you have with SLA is you can set an SLA for a specific execution plan, right, and not do the global for the entire application. So it's not a very flexible way to generate events from your synthetic data. So really, I mean, it's our recommendation that if you can possibly get away with not using SLA, do it, right, and just use synthetic metric rules for your event configuration. And let's take a look at how you would turn that off. The other thing about SLA is, let me go to configuration and synthetic metric rules. It's turned off here, right? So it's either turned on or off globally for every application. So if you turn on SLA here, it's turned on globally for every application that you've got. So again, if you can possibly get away from using it, please do so and use the rules. So let's talk about the rules in a little more depth. The first thing I'm going to do is walk through a rule real quick and show you some of the new additions and functions in it, and point out some things along the way that may help you. Hey, so here we're going to create a brand new rule.
Todd?
Yes.
There's a question from Sahil Sharma. He's asking, on that page you were just showing, there's something that says accuracy errors. When on the page you were just referring to, he was asking what does that mean?
So the accuracy errors were covered in the very first slide, and an accuracy error is generated when the response data that is expected from the script is not returned. Okay. And if that doesn't clear it up, we can have a longer discussion at the end.
Okay, and we have another question from Mohammed. Mohammed, I've unmuted you, so you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes. If we select the SLA event in off option, this will impact the synthetic overview dashlet in the dashboard. For example, if we make this SLA is off, if we have any availability or performance on accuracy error, all the executions health will be green. The color will not impact it.
That is absolutely correct. And it is something that I failed to mention. So the other difference between SLA generated events and synthetic metric rule generated events is the status of the synthetic icon within the application view. This icon right here that I'm touching on. The status of that only changes via a breach of an SLA and not a synthetic metric rule. Now that has no bearing on, because they both impact the status of the application, right? So if you turn off the SLA and you're only using synthetic metric rules, the status of your application would be represented by the severity of the event from your synthetic metric rule. But he's absolutely right. A synthetic metric rule does not show or does not change the status of this synthetic tier within the tool. Okay. Okay. So
it is not only in the synthetic tier; it's also in the synthetic overview dashlet in the dashboard.
Correct. Yes.
Green.
Yes, that is correct. So the dashlets that use that the synthetic data, that is correct, would also not show those particular events.
Yes,
absolutely.
For example, if I run one execution, I have 4 different type of errors: availability, executions errors, performance, accuracy error. If I need to enable only performance and the availability and the accuracy and discard the executions error. If some executions error happen, I'm just to give example, not impact or change the color of the synthetic field, or to be correct, if accuracy error happened, I don't need this to impact in the dashboard or the synthetic tier. I need only the availability error and the performance error. We can do something like this.
I am not aware of a way to do that off the top of my head. I think whenever Brent joins, he may have some ideas. let's table that one temporarily until we can get maybe Brent or Todd on the line to see if there's something that we could do about that.
Yeah, let's go ahead and move forward. And Mohammed, we'll take that as an item, and we'll address it at the end, and maybe follow up with you on that. Go ahead, Todd.
Okay. Synthetic metric rules. So let's get back to the rules. Back here in the rules, if you create a new rule, and actually before I create a rule, let's talk about this real quick, and we're actually going to come back to the screen again. There are some out-of-the-box rules whenever you install the product. You have one for each event type: availability, accuracy, execution, and performance. And they're kind of what I would consider like a catch-all rule, right? As you can see, it's any application, any execution plan, any transaction, any location for these guys. And what you'll notice also here too is you can't delete, right? You can only edit and or deactivate. And from an edit perspective, there are only a few things that you can edit, such as the violation frequency and the well, basically that's for the most part it, the violation frequency and your threshold. Okay, we're going to come back to this in just a minute on why that may be important to help you streamline your environment. So let's get back to creating this synthetic metric rule. So let's create the rule. Naturally, you have to give it a name. So a best practice for giving it a name would be to kind of preface it with the application itself. And whenever we start talking about rule hierarchy, that's going to come into play, right? So I'm going to do this one for the only real application that I have with transactions running against it. I'll show you the rule that I created to bring it from 6 events down to 1, right? So I've already turned off SLA, that gets rid of 3. So I've got 3 left. So basically I generated a performance, availability, and accuracy event because I was using the out-of-the-box rule. So this is the rule that I created to get rid of it. So I just called it stock trader availability, performance, or accuracy. So basically what I'm going to do here when I get down to the bottom is create one rule for all of these, right? Now, so something that's new is this violation frequency. So it's, you can read it here, just, events created if the number of impacted execution cycles reached within the total number of execution cycles. So it's not a consecutive type deal. So if you said, if there's 3 executions, 3 impacted in a total of 10 execution cycles, right? Then it would, if all those criteria are met, then the event would be generated. So in my case, I just left it default as the 1 and 1. So if it happens at all, right, go ahead and continue. So the next thing is I selected the application, right? So this is, I can't do in 11.301 or even earlier versions, I can't do an any here, right? This is going to have to apply to a specific application. So I have to select an application. In this case, it's stock trader. Now the rest of this is up to me, right? If I have multiple execution plans, if I have multiple transactions, right, I can be very specific here on what I want to say. In this one, I only have one execution plan and 1 transaction, so it doesn't really make any sense for me to be more specific at this point. The next thing that you can do here, and what I did, was I selected the metrics for testing. So I did accuracy, availability, and performance. Right. And so I said if any of these, and I logically OR'd them, right? So I can or I can and. I can't do or and in the same thing. But I said if any of these are having a problem, right, then what I want to do is generate the alert. Something else to point out is, if you're like me and you're creating a performance rule and you get down to the performance part and you go, oh shoot, I don't know what I should set the threshold to. I didn't really go look, right? You can do the show statistics whenever you get to the performance part, and it'll help you out by giving you a min, max, and average for the performance of that guy, so you could set your threshold correctly. Doesn't really matter for me at this point because I've already got this rule. I'm not actually going to save it. And then the last thing I want to show you here, talk about, is this locations component. right? So when we talk about performance from scripts, you know, in a perfect world, you're running all on the same exact hardware, and then all the networks are perfect from your different locations, and so you're not going to have a lot of variance between the execution times and even sometimes availability, depending on your network. And so there's not a lot of variance, and so you can set things pretty tight and not worry about it. If you want to get away with fewer and fewer rules, right, and that's kind of the goal, is to cut down on some of the maintenance of this stuff here, is, you know, using something like the violation frequency that I pointed out at the top for a rule to try and get away with a single rule, or using something like, you know, maybe I know that I've got, you know, 4 or 5 locations, and one of them always runs a little bit slower than the others. That would always trip my event. So I could say, you know, at least, you know, 75% or 50% of the locations must have this condition before an event is generated, or be more specific, as you can see here. So really, this is to help take out some of the variance between the different locations to help you cut down on the number of rules that you have to write in order to do this kind of thing. So speaking of that, so I've got a rule here, that's a single rule that's going to do performance, availability, and accuracy. So instead of generating 3 events, right, I'm going to only generate 1. I'm going to cancel this. So you're always going to have, you know, at least 1, right, at the very least, 1 synthetic metric rule per application. And to help you kind of in this area, right, you can clone, right? So if this is the kind of event you want to do, you would clone it. We'll just change the name of it and change the application, and then continue on and save, and it kind of cuts down on the time that you have to deal with in order to create these rules, right? So now I've got a new rule. We're going to talk here for a minute about rule hierarchy. Okay, you guys are familiar with TrueSight. If you're using the monitoring part of our solution, you're familiar with policies. There is no policy. There's no policies here. These are rules, but there is a rule hierarchy, right? So some things are going to take precedence over others, and it depends on what you have selected for application. So the tighter you have this selection, so application being the first, execution plan the second, and transaction the third, it'll dictate which of these rules get applied. So for instance, I have everything supplied for my stock trader, right? I have the application name, I have the execution plan name, I have the transaction name. Even if I didn't have transaction or execution plan, I had to specify the application. And I'm using a multi-metric, which is performance, availability, and accuracy. It's automatically going to take precedence over the catch-all performance, availability, and accuracy out-of-the-box rules that we have, right? So keep that in mind when you're building your other rules. If, for instance, I created one for this application called App1 that's just performance and availability. This App1 actually has multiple execution plans. He has an App1 trans 1 that you see here and an App1 trans 2. So in this particular example, application, the performance and availability would, the rules for performance and availability for App1 trans 1 and would not be showing up here, right? So it wouldn't be using these guys. So there's a whole section with about 10 different examples within the documentation on rule hierarchy. So let's kind of go back here. We'll have just a few minutes left. Kind of talk about some of the stuff we pointed out. So some of the helpful hints, and I kind of talked about some of this and others I didn't, right? Turn off the SLA if it's not needed, and we had that just a little bit of a discussion about what the differences between SLA and SMR is. Edit the catch-all rules where applicable if you're using them. So I mentioned the catch-all rules, they won't be used if you've got a rule specifically for that particular event type. But if you are using them as catch-alls, maybe you can edit something like the violation frequency to cut down on the number of events. We talked about reclassifying accuracy and/or execution errors. If that's something that you need that would help you out, remember to do that. If possible, right, create a single rule for all the metrics, performance, availability, and accuracy, right? We'll cut down on the number of events. Naturally, this is going to depend upon lots of different factors, right? It's not a one-size-fits-all deal here. So you'll have to evaluate your own situation. You take advantage of the percentage of locations and violation frequency options to take out some of that variance in generating extraneous events. Remember to create your big funnels first and then add additional rules as needed. So start out with something simple, and then add additional rules as you need them, and trying to cut down on those as much as possible. Count on at least one rule per app. And that's typically around performance, right? Because different apps and different scripts are going to run at different response times. Name your rules accordingly. We talked about that as well, so that it's easier to sort things out when you're looking at them from a rule perspective, and that's mostly because you need to remember the rule hierarchy, right? So if you're trying to figure something out why you did or didn't get an event, naming those rules can kind of help you track down why you did or didn't, based upon the rule hierarchy. We talked about using cloning when possible. So that's going to speed up the whole process of creating rules against your applications. And if you're upgrading from 10.7 or 11 to 11.3, look at the documentation on what happens to your current synthetic metric rules during this migration. You may need to make some changes. And if you're coming from TMART, leverage the BMC tools and documentation. You'll probably have to go through support to get that kind of stuff, but we do have some tools and documentation for migrating, I forget what they're called in TMART, but basically it's the rules into the current way we do synthetic metric rules. And lastly, this will be included in the presentation. Like I said, the documentation is very good. This is your synthetic metric rule events and explanations, and how to do that reclassifying of your error configuration within the tool. Seth, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Okay, so Todd, we've got we've got a few questions here. The first question I just want to address quickly is, do you know if the documentation you're showing right here explains the order of evaluation?
It does.
Okay, so Marvi, if you can hear that, use that first link, I think, and it will show you the order of evaluation. Then we have Sahil. I think we answered his question about the definition of what an accuracy error is, but he was wondering about in the application execution plan and the transaction, can you select like locations? If you don't want to select all, can you, let's see.
Yes.
Yes.
So yeah, you can do a percentage or you can do a specific location.
Got it. Okay. So Sahil, I'm happy to unmute you if you would like to ask that question, but hopefully that clarified. And then I think he said the last question he had was, there was still a question about whether or not you can select multiple, I'm not sure to what he was referring. It was during your presentation. Select multiple at the same time. It's a radio button and not a checkbox. I think it was when you were defining the criteria. Let me go ahead and see if I can get clarification from him. Let me unmute him. It just takes me a second here. Okay, so Hill, I've got you unmuted if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
I was asking that under when you select multiple in your application and execution plan and transaction, we cannot select the locations, right? We cannot select the multiple business transaction at the same time. We need to associate only one plan at a time, right? One application basically.
So you can select yes or any, right? So the rule would apply to a specific plan or any of the plans that you have. if that makes sense.
Same rule to multiple applications. So is that possible, or we need to create multiple rules for that?
You'd have to do that clone method. You'd have to create at least one rule per application. Correct.
Okay.
Thank you for the question.
Yep. And same thing is for the next question on to the locations. It gives us the option to do either any location or all location or a percentage of location, but not the if we choose the option specific location, will we be getting the option to further choose based on to the drop down? Or
yes, if you can see my screen, I just did it. Yep.
Okay, good. Here it is a checkbox. Got it.
Yeah, and those are checkboxes.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, the only other thing, Thad, sorry, it's Todd, that I would add is that sometimes when people don't realize when you're selecting the metrics, the list that's available is also bound to the higher level criteria. So if I don't pick a transaction and I only pick an execution plan, my selecting metrics list is orientated to that selection. So unless I pick a transaction, I can't pick a custom timer as an example, because that level of metric is bound to a particular transaction. So what you set up from an application, execution plan, transaction will drive which metrics will be available in the select metric list.
Thank you, Todd.
Yep.
Okay, so I'm looking in the chat window and I'm looking in the Q&A, and I don't see any other questions. If you have any other last-minute questions, feel free to go ahead and ping us. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and just close out. So, Todd, if you could just put that slide back up one more time with the links. So I want to let everybody know that this slide deck that Todd used here, we will add to the event in BMC Communities, and I will be. This session has been recorded, so shortly after I convert the video, I will also post it on BMC Communities. So if you have followed that particular event, or if you RSVP to the event, you should get the updates when those come out. And as I mentioned, we do this every 2 weeks, so I will be sending out invitations and doing notifications for the next session once we establish the topic, and so on and so forth. And I want to thank everybody for their attendance and time today, and particularly for their participation. And with that, we will go ahead and